In the far western reaches of the Zhou Empire, beyond the cultivated fields of the Central Plains and the ritualized grandeur of the royal court, the land became wilder, harsher, less defined by the rules of civilization and more by the raw force of nature. It was there, on the fringes of the known world, that a girl was born into obscurity, into a tribe whose name rarely entered the annals of official history. She was given no fanfare at her birth, no bronze inscriptions heralding her arrival. But time would elevate her name to infamy. Bao Si, later romanized as Bao Si. The early records say little of her origins. Some claimed she was captured during one of the Western campaigns against the Rong and Di tribes. Others said she was offered as tribute by a defeated chieftain desperate to preserve the ashes of his people. Whatever the truth, by the time she entered the palace, she was no longer merely a girl from the western wilds. She had become a figure carved from silence and mystery, a living enigma cloaked in beauty so transcendent it was said to unnerve even the most hardened generals and sages. Her presence in the Zhou capital did not stir celebration but rather unease, a premonition wrapped in silk. The palace of Haojing, center of the Western Zhou court, had long been a fortress of Confucian hierarchy and ritual order. Kings ruled not by absolute power but by the mandate of heaven, mediated through a delicate latticework of vassals and bloodlines. And yet, in the final decades of its existence, the foundation of that ancient power had begun to erode. King Yu of Zhou, the monarch who reigned during this tremulous time, had inherited a court riddled with discontent. His ministers whispered of omens, his vassals grew restive, and the once glorious aura of his dynasty had begun to dim beneath the weight of complacency and excess. Into this crumbling world stepped Bao Si. She did not arrive with ambition. She did not speak of conquest or wealth. She did not charm with laughter or performance. In truth, she barely spoke at all. Her silence became her legend. Unlike the courtesans who vied for attention with wit and song, Bao Si stood apart, an unmoving flame that flickered not through words but through presence. Her face, it was said, bore the solemn tranquility of the moon over a quiet lake. Her eyes were dark, fathomless, and still. When she walked, she moved like mist through the trees, seen, felt, and yet elusive. King Yu, who had once listened to his ministers with deference and attended ceremonies with practiced solemnity, found himself drawn to her stillness. It was not lust, not in the crude sense. It was fascination, a compulsion born of absence. She never laughed, not even when courtiers performed ridiculous feats, nor when gestures twisted themselves into knots. She would observe, blink slowly, and turn away. Her indifference became a riddle that the king, once a ruler of states, now sought to solve like a love-struck youth. His obsession grew, and with it, the court shifted. Queen Shen, a princess of the powerful Shen state and mother of his heir, was deposed. Her son, Crown Prince Ijiu, a boy groomed in the rites and classics, was cast aside. The ministers protested, but the king waved them away. The queen was exiled, the prince stripped of title, and Bao Si installed as the new consort. The court recoiled in horror, but none dared confront the sovereign who had, for all his weakness, become unpredictable. Historians would later debate whether Bao Si orchestrated these events or merely bore them. No records exist of her giving orders or plotting behind closed doors. She signed no decrees, issued no proclamations. She remained silent even as bloodlines fractured and states fumed. But silence is not absence. Her mere existence, coupled with the king's obsession, was enough to dismantle years of balance. It was not long before the king began to bend the state itself in service of a single goal, to make Bao Si smile. That she never did became the most dangerous mystery in the kingdom. He constructed towers of music and gardens of rare blooms. He summoned contortionists, dancers from distant lands, beasts from the southern jungles, and magicians from the eastern ports. Still, she did not smile. Not when jewels were scattered before her feet, not when temples were erected in her name. The king began to dream of her face. Ministers found him seated for hours, staring at a blank wall, murmuring questions no one could answer. Then came the signal towers. For centuries, the border beacons, massive fire pits placed along ridges, served as an ancient alarm system. If invaders approached, the watchmen would light them, and the flames would leap from hill to hill until the capital was warned and the vassals summoned. It was a sacred right of defense, a mechanism of survival in a kingdom that had long feared barbarian incursions. King Yu, in his desperation, ordered them lit. Not for war, but for spectacle. The night sky blazed with signals of danger, and the vassals came rushing in arms only to find the capital untouched, the king seated beside Bao Si, watching her with manic hope. She did not smile. The lords were furious. The kingdom had been mocked. The beacon system, once sacred, now turned into farce. And still the king lit the towers again and again. Some claimed he had gone mad. Others whispered that Bao Si held him under a spell. But no evidence emerged of her manipulating anything. She sat in the background, unmoved as the state spiraled downward. The result was inevitable. The Shin state, enraged by the exile of their princess and the betrayal of their grandson, allied with the Rong tribes to the west, those same peoples whose daughters had once been taken as tribute and whose lands had long been threatened. Together they marched on the capital. The fire beacons were lit once more, but no one came. The vassals, tired of games, ignored the call. And this time, the enemy was real. The palace was breached. The court scattered. King Yu was cut down near Mountly. Some accounts say Bao Si was seized and executed. Others claim she was taken by the Rong as a trophy, vanishing into legend. A few believe she escaped, disappearing into the mountains, her face never seen again. Regardless, her silence ended with the collapse of a dynasty. In the ashes of that fall, a new king was placed on the throne. Crouching in the shadows of his father's shame, young Yijio was recalled and crowned as Kingping at Chuping Wang. But he would not rule from Haojing. The capital was moved east to Luoyang, away from the ghosts of failure. Thus began the Eastern Zhou, a dynasty in name only, where kings reigned without ruling and power fractured into the hands of ambitious lords. And yet, in the dreams of courtiers, in the haunted poetry of later dynasties, one image endured, not of war or politics, but of a woman who never smiled and a kingdom that burned to see her do so. In the fading glow of Western Zhou's twilight, the court of Haojing became a palace of illusions, where reality was measured not by the state of the realm, but by the expressions of a single woman. Bao Si, Lady Bao of the Si clan, now known to history as the Silent Consort, held no title of power, issued no commands, and yet determined the fate of a civilization through nothing more than her presence and her refusal to laugh. Kings had ruled by the mandate of heaven, a divine decree contingent upon virtue and justice. But King Yu had come to believe that heaven's favor resided in the curl of Bao Si's lips. Her silence became not a quirk of personality, but a test he could not pass. An obsession that drove him to sacrifice stability for the faint hope of evoking mirth. And so began his descent into spectacle, into farce, into ruin. No one could recall when the king first began speaking of her laughter as a matter of state. Only that his longing intensified over time. At first, he commissioned performances, musicians, acrobats, and jesters were summoned from across the kingdom and beyond. They performed in grand courtyards under moonlit nights, contorting and clowning, juggling fire and leaping through hoops as noble women and eunuchs looked on. Bao Si watched, impassive. Her expression never wavered, never betrayed even the subtlest sign of amusement. The court began to whisper that she was cursed. Others suggested she had witnessed horrors in her childhood that robbed her of joy. But most feared to speculate at all. She was no longer simply a consort, she had become an oracle of mood. Her silence like an eclipse over the sun, unsettling and unmovable. Ministers grew wary of speaking in her presence. Generals avoided her gaze. Servants bowed deeper than usual, as if to appease an unseen force emanating from her stillness. King Yu, undeterred, escalated his efforts. Exotic animals were imported from distant lands. White tigers, dancing bears, talking parrots from the southern jungles. He built a vast menagerie for her pleasure. On one occasion, he dyed a monkey's fur with gold powder and trained it to mimic his own courtly gestures. Bao Si blinked once, then turned away. The king began to change. He no longer attended council meetings. His seals of authority passed through eunuchs without review. Edicts became erratic, lavish, and often contradictory. He gave entire fiefdoms as gifts to performers who claimed they could amuse her. He ordered temples built in her honor, their walls adorned with paintings of imagined smiles that she might one day emulate. The treasury emptied like a river during drought. It was then that he turned to the fire beacons. The signal towers were ancient and sacred. Placed on high ridges, they served as a lifeline for the Zhou kingdom. lighting the sky to warn of barbarian invasions. A single flame could summon thousands of troops. It was not merely military, it was ritual, a covenant between king and vassals. King Yu chose to violate that covenant for the sake of a single smile. On a quiet evening, he gave the order. The beacons were lit. The mountains glowed with tongues of fire, and the vassal states responded in panic. Armies were mobilized, couriers dispatched. Horses galloped through the night. Lords arrived at the capital expecting bloodshed, only to find peace and laughter not from Bao Si, but from courtiers bewildered by the absurdity. She did not smile. The lords were not amused. They had spent fortunes and lives responding to what they believed was an existential threat. King Yu greeted them with wine and apologies, brushing off their rage with a wave of his hand. But the damage was done. The trust between king and vassals, once frayed, now tore completely. Still, he repeated the stunt. Again and again. The beacons were lit. Each time, Bao Si watched the flames from her tower. Some say she leaned forward once, narrowing her eyes as the lights danced across the sky. But even then, her lips remained motionless. A kind of madness settled over the palace. It was not the screaming, violent madness of tyrants, but a quiet erosion of reason. Ministers resigned. Some defected to other states. A few took their own lives. The royal family fractured. The queen, Shun, long exiled, was heard lamenting from afar. Her son, Prince Ijo, now lived in obscurity, his future uncertain. And all the while, Bao Si remained at the king's side, calm, composed, eternal. One might wonder what she thought of it all. Did she understand the weight of her silence? Did she notice the kingdom cracking around her like ice beneath spring thaw? Or did she truly feel nothing? No joy, no sadness, no guilt? Historians have no answer. She left no letters, no speeches, no trace of interior life. Only her image survives. Painted on scrolls, carved in jade, depicted always with the same unreadable gaze. What is certain is this. Her silence became the theater upon which the final act of the Western Zhou was staged. Outside the palace, storms gathered. The Rong tribes, long insulted and encroached upon, began to stir. The Xin state, insulted by the king's rejection of their daughter, prepared for war. Across the central plains, feudal lords began to speak openly of secession, of the king's unfitness to rule. The Zhou, once unquestioned in authority, now seemed more like a ceremonial relic than a living power. King Yu did not notice. Or if he did not care. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a woman's silence. His ministers had become stagehands, his soldiers props in an elaborate performance designed to chase a fantasy. They say that at night, Bao Si would walk alone in the gardens of the palace. That she would pause beneath the plum trees and look up at the stars. That her face, illuminated by moonlight, appeared almost serene. But no one ever saw her smile. And so, the beacons would burn again. Not long after, the gates of Haojing would fall. The kingdom, hollowed by obsession, would collapse beneath the weight of its own illusions. But in these final moments, the court remained suspended in a dream lit by fire and haunted by the laughter that never came. The wind across the western ridges carried with it more than the scent of dust and pine. It brought rumors, discontent, and something darker, the scent of opportunity. Far beyond the gilded halls of the Zhou court, where fires were lit for laughter and kingdoms were treated as theaters, the edges of the empire began to boil. The Rong tribes, long considered barbarians by the Zhou elite, watched with growing interest as the central authority cracked. They remembered old wounds and humiliations, remembered villages burned in royal campaigns, and bloodlines severed in the name of civilization. And now, they saw the signal towers of the Zhou not as warnings, but as invitations. Each time King Yu lit the fire beacons in jest, the credibility of the entire system of defense eroded. The last time they had been lit, no enemy had been present, but the next time, no one would believe it. This was not merely a tactical failure. It was the collapse of ritual, the very order upon which the Zhou mandate of heaven was built. And in the Zhou world, where political power was derived from cosmic harmony, the unraveling of that harmony was no small matter. It was apocalypse in slow motion. Within the court itself, the tension became unbearable. Senior ministers, once loyal beyond reproach, found themselves doubting not only their king but the very institution of kingship. The rituals of the ancestral temple rang hollow. The bronzes engraved with oaths of loyalty began to feel like relics of a forgotten age. While King Yu remained fixated on Bao Si's silence, the machinery of governance fell into paralysis. The economy suffered first. With resources diverted to lavish entertainments, bribes, and constructions designed to delight a single woman, trade faltered. Tribute from vassal states became irregular or stopped altogether. The coinage of the court began to lose value. Merchants closed their stalls. Artisans left the city. In the markets of Haojing, once the most vibrant in all of Zhou, the stalls were half empty and the streets unusually quiet. But it was not just coin and commerce that suffered, it was trust. The lords of the realm, whose fiefs formed the patchwork of Zhou authority, began to speak in low voices of betrayal. The king had mocked their loyalty, dismissed their sacrifices, and disregarded the oaths sworn in ancestral halls. For the first time in centuries, they began to consider acting without royal sanction. The state of Xin was the first to stir. Queen Xin, once the principal consort of King Yu, had been humiliated and exiled when Bao Si rose to power. Her son, Yijiu, the rightful crown prince, had been stripped of title and cast aside. Though he remained alive, his fate was uncertain, dangling on the edge of obscurity. But Queen Xin's family had not forgotten. The Xin clan, proud and powerful, took the insult personally. They began to seek allies not only within the Zhou nobility, but beyond the borders of the so-called civilized world. It was in the mountain passes and grassy plains that the most unlikely alliance formed. The Xin emissaries approached the Rong. Once bitter enemies, now they found a common cause in vengeance. The Rong tribes had long suffered under Zhou campaigns, their warriors slaughtered, their women taken, their sons sold as slaves. Now they saw a chance to strike back, not just militarily, but symbolically. The plan was simple. The Xin would guide them to the capital. The Rong would attack, and together, they would bring an end to the reign of a king who had turned a sacred empire into a stage for a single woman's amusement. Back in Haojing, King Yu remained unaware of the approaching storm. Or perhaps, as some would later say, he simply did not care. His focus remained fixed on Bao Si. He had become thin, erratic, and hollow-eyed. He spoke to her in riddles. He dreamed aloud. He often wandered the palace at night, whispering to himself. His ministers avoided him. The nobles dared not challenge him. His guards watched in silence. Bao Si, as ever, said nothing. On the day the enemy arrived, the beacons were not lit. Whether out of negligence, disbelief, or fear, the signal towers remained dark. The defenders were few, the walls poorly manned. The Rong and Xin forces, having crossed the rivers and hills with terrifying speed, reached the capital gates before dawn. Screams echoed across the stone courtyards. Fire spread through the city like ink on silk. The palace guards fought with what little spirit remained in them, but the defense was half-hearted. The king's reputation had already died. His body merely followed. King Yu, they say, tried to flee to Mount Li, the ancient site of imperial tombs, as if hoping that the spirits of his ancestors would shield him. They did not. He was killed on the slopes, his body unceremoniously left to rot. The king who lit the beacons for laughter died alone, unwept and unloved. As for Bao Si, the records diverge. Some say she was captured by the Rong and taken as a war prize, a trophy to parade before conquered kin. Others claim she was executed on the spot. Her body displayed in the capital square as a symbol of the end. A few whispers suggest she escaped, vanishing into the western mountains where no chronicler could follow. Whatever the truth, her silence ended that day. Not because she spoke, but because there was no one left to listen. The capital of Haojing lay in ruin. The once mighty Western Zhou was no more. The ancestral temples were defiled. The ritual bronzes scattered and looted. The palace gardens burned. The civilization that had once claimed to civilize all others had fallen not to a superior army or natural disaster, but to its own vanity, its own blindness, its own rot. And yet, from the ashes, a new figure rose. The Xin, having exacted their revenge, now moved to restore what they had helped destroy. They found the exiled Prince Yijiu and declared him king. But not in Haojing. The old capital was dead. The court was moved east to Luoyang, a new city, a new chapter. And with this move, the Eastern Zhou began, not with triumph, but with survival. The king reigned, but he did not rule. Power passed into the hands of warlords and ministers, regional lords and opportunists. The Zhou dynasty would linger for centuries more, but only as a ghost of its former self. In later generations, scholars and poets would speak of Bao Si as a symbol. Some called her a temptress, a femme fatale whose silence unmade empires. Others saw her as a victim, a woman caught in the madness of men, used as a mirror for their obsessions. A few saw something deeper, that she was the embodiment of a world that had grown brittle and vain, where rituals had lost meaning and kings no longer heard the cries of their people. She never laughed, and the kingdom, desperate to hear it, burned itself down trying. The ruins of Haojing smoked for days, and with them the last embers of the Western Zhou court extinguished themselves against the scorched earth of history. The capital, once the polished crown of the Middle Kingdom, stood violated, its ancient temples looted, its bronze ritual vessels shattered. Its proud banners trampled beneath the feet of those who had once feared the name Zhou. The cries of soldiers, nobles, and commoners alike blended into the ash, dissolving into the wind as if the very heavens sought to erase what had taken centuries to build. No rituals marked the fall. No oracles proclaimed the severing of heaven's mandate, though all understood that it had been lost. The Zhou had ruled for generations, claiming divine sanction over the known world. But in the end, it was not foreign armies or plague that undid them. It was a flame lit in jest, a woman who never laughed, and a king who mistook obsession for love, performance for governance, and illusion for truth. The palace itself became a mausoleum of hubris. The central throne room where generations of kings had performed ancestral rites stood empty. The walls, once lacquered and gold-leafed, now bore the soot of torches and the scars of blades. The garden of distant fragrance, built to coax a smile from Bao Si, lay in ruin. The pavilion where she had watched the signal towers burn had collapsed. Its beams snapped like brittle bones. The marble paths were cracked, the lily ponds drained or fouled, and the pines that once whispered over imperial walks now creaked with a funereal rasp. King Yu's body was eventually found not far from Mount Li, where the tombs of past kings loomed like silent judges. His death was not heroic. There had been no final stand, no last command, no farewell to his court. He died as he lived in his final years, chasing shadows. The hands that once held the jade seal of the Son of Heaven now grasped at dust. There was no mourning procession, no sacrifice of oxen, no bronze bells to mark the passing of a dynasty. The people had wept out of fear before, now they wept from exhaustion. The silence that followed was deafening. It was in this vacuum that the state of Shen acted, not out of nobility or piety, but calculation. Their vengeance against King Yu complete, they understood the danger of power unclaimed. Chaos had no center, and nature abhorred such emptiness. To prevent rivals from seizing the symbolic weight of the Zhou name, they moved quickly to retrieve Prince Yizhou, the exiled son of the former queen, Shen's own blood. He had spent the final years of his father's reign in political limbo, neither executed nor embraced, neither condemned nor crowned. Now he became essential. The coronation was somber and unadorned. There was no capital to host it, no palace worthy of its legacy. Instead, in the interim halls of Shen territory, Yizhou was declared Kingping Chu Ping Wang, the first ruler of what would come to be known as the Eastern Zhou. But even as the rites were performed and the bamboo slips recorded his ascension, the truth was understood by all. The Zhou king was now a shadow, a symbol, a hollow bell echoing the past. The new capital was chosen with purpose. Far to the east of Haojing, Lui, later known as Luoyang, was established not for its strength but for its neutrality. Nestled in the middle of contending vassals, it offered no strategic advantage, only proximity and the illusion of continuity. There, the king would sit upon a throne, issue decrees, and preside over ceremonies. But the power he wielded would be ceremonial. Real authority would belong to those with armies, grain, and the courage to defy tradition. Thus, the Eastern Zhou was born not of victory but of necessity. Across the realm, the old order crumbled. Vassal states, once deferential, now asserted independence with increasing boldness. The state of Qin to the west, long regarded as a barbarous buffer, began to consolidate and militarize. Xi to the east, flush with wealth and population, ignored royal commands altogether. Jin and Chu watched with predatory patience. The royal court could no longer compel tribute or loyalty, it could only request, negotiate, or beg. In this fractured landscape, the image of Bao Si lingered like an afterimage on the eyes of a blind man. Though she had vanished, her fate uncertain, her body never recovered, her influence endured. She became legend, myth, curse, and cautionary tale. Bards sang of her in taverns, scholars debated her in academies, and priests invoked her in warnings. Some blamed her entirely for the fall. Others saw her as a vessel, a mirror reflecting the king's own rot. In the minds of the people, Bao Si became the embodiment of fatal beauty. Her name was spoken with reverence and dread. Parents warned their sons, "Beware the woman who does not laugh. Beware the silence that follows desire." In a culture obsessed with balance and harmony, she became a symbol of what happens when that balance tilts too far, when yin consumes yang, when emotion overpowers duty. Yet others saw in her something tragic, perhaps even noble. She had not asked to be queen. She had not spoken treason. She had not demanded power. She had simply existed, refusing to pretend, refusing to perform the joy expected of her. In a world where women were ornaments and laughter a form of currency, she had withheld the one coin everyone craved. That act, whether conscious or not, became rebellion. King Ping, meanwhile, understood the weight of the throne he now held. He had grown up watching the court disintegrate. He had heard the rumors, seen the betrayals, felt the sting of abandonment. Now seated upon a throne with no teeth, he faced a realm disillusioned with monarchy and itching for autonomy. His ministers urged reconciliation. His scribes begged for clarity. The gods, it seemed, had stopped answering altogether. There were no wars of conquest in those early years, only negotiations, appeasements, and ceremonies. King Ping performed the rites with care, offered sacrifices to heaven, and attempted to restore a sense of sacred rhythm. But the music had changed. The bronzes no longer sang. The feasts no longer dazzled. The people bowed but no longer believed. And always, behind it all, was the ghost of Bao Si. Some said she was still alive, hidden in the west, living among the Rong under another name. Others claimed she had died in fire, her silence broken only by the scream of war. A few whispered that she had ascended, become a goddess, or perhaps a demon, depending on who spoke. But no one knew for certain. Her story had left history and entered legend, and in that transformation she gained immortality. In Luoyang, King Ping ordered a new set of chronicles to be written. Ones that would downplay the chaos, soften the scandal, and reframe the transition as an act of heavenly will. But paper could not mend broken hearts. Ink could not revive ancestral pride. The mandate of heaven had not been revoked in a single moment. It had withered over years, drained by neglect, emptied by indulgence, and ultimately set aflame by folly. The Western Zhou had not been defeated by enemies. It had been unmade by laughter that never came. King Ping of Zhou ascended the throne not with the triumph of a dynasty renewed, but with the reluctant ascent of a nation exhausted. He was not hailed with trumpets or welcomed by processions of armored chariots. No celestial omens appeared in the sky. No phoenixes landed on palace roofs. No sages declared the restoration of virtue. His enthronement in Luoyang was a quiet affair, surrounded by whispers, cautious bows, and eyes that no longer gleamed with hope but with the dull sheen of duty. He was the heir of a broken age, the son of a fallen court, the child of collapse. From the very beginning of his reign, King Ping understood what had been lost. He remembered Haojing not as a palace of wonders, but as a place of shadows. He had seen his mother weep in exile, had watched loyal retainers disappear without explanation, had heard the screams echo across the city walls as the Rong descended on the capital. The smell of burning pine and blood had stayed with him even as he crossed the rivers into the east. Though he now wore the robes of heaven's chosen, he carried the memories of a child abandoned by both father and state. His court in Luoyang reflected the uncertainty of the age. Built in haste and shaped by compromise, the city lacked the majesty of Haojing. It had no ancient halls, no ancestral shrines, no history written in bronze. Instead, it was a place of negotiation, a capital designed not to command, but to appease. Its walls stood more for symbolism than defense. Its towers served not to watch the horizon but to display banners of ritual continuity. King Ping knew he did not rule. The true power lay with the feudal lords, Qi in the east, Jin in the north, Chu in the south, and Qin in the west. These states had grown stronger as the Zhou court weakened, and now they no longer feared the center. They paid lip service to the king's authority, sent token tributes, attended occasional rituals, but they answered to no one but themselves. The king was a name on a tablet, a figure at the head of the ancestral rites, not a force that could command armies or alter destinies. And yet, King Ping did not rebel against this fate. He had no illusions of grandeur. He knew that the dynasty his father had broken could not be rebuilt with words alone. Instead, he turned inward. He devoted himself to ceremony, to the rebuilding of temples, to the codification of rituals. He summoned philosophers and scholars to reconstruct the rites that had once governed Zhou life. He ordered scribes to revise the records, to soften the edges of the past, to preserve dignity even in disgrace. But even as he shaped the image of the Eastern Zhou, he could not escape the specter that haunted its beginning, Bao Si. She was gone, her body never recovered, her fate uncertain, but her presence remained. She was invoked in poems, cursed in court documents, and whispered about in rural markets. She had become more than a person. She was a parable, a caution, a ghost that lingered in the eyes of ministers and the cracks in the throne. King Ping had never met her, but she shaped his life more profoundly than any living soul. In private moments, he asked himself what kind of woman she had truly been. Had she loved his father? Had she been a manipulator? Or simply silent? Was her refusal to laugh an act of cruelty or of defiance? Had she chosen her fate or had it been thrust upon her? The records offered no clarity. The poems contradicted each other. One account described her as a phoenix in the snow, another as a snake in silk. King Ping, in his solitude, began to write. Not for proclamation, not for decree, but for understanding. In a series of bamboo scrolls never shared with his court, he composed reflections on the nature of power, beauty, and downfall. He titled them Meditations on a Silent Flame. Within, he questioned the values of his ancestors, the structure of his society, the failure of his father, and the role of women in a world shaped by men who feared their silence more than their voices. He wrote, "We feared the barbarians at our borders, yet we feared more the stillness of a single woman. We built towers not to defend against war, but to chase her laughter. And in doing so, we set fire to the mandate of heaven." But writing did not grant him peace. Outside the palace, the world shifted rapidly. The feudal lords began their own wars, carving power from the corpse of central authority. Qi launched military campaigns under the guise of trade protection. Jin expanded into contested territories with strategic marriages and betrayals. Chu, a state once considered semi-civilized, began absorbing southern regions and imposing its own legal codes. Qin, isolated and disciplined, began organizing its military infrastructure in ways that would echo for centuries. King Ping could only watch. He held ceremonies, sent envoys, and issued proclamations all ignored. He organized annual sacrifices to heaven and earth, summoning lords to witness the rites. Fewer came each year. His own ministers began acting independently, striking deals with feudal states behind his back. His court became a theater of masks, loyalty on the surface, ambition underneath. In one particularly bitter winter, a famine swept through the northern provinces. King Ping ordered relief grain to be distributed. The officials in charge siphoned half of it to fund private armies. The people starved while the bureaucracy applauded itself for efficiency. When reports reached the king, he wept, not for the hungry, but for his impotence. That night, he burned several of the scrolls he had written. In the ash, he saw her face. Not smiling, still silent. Time passed, and with it the last generation who remembered the grandeur of the Western Zhou. Children born in Luoyang knew no other court. To them, King Ping was not a shadow of a dynasty, but the only ruler they had ever known. And so, slowly, the Eastern Zhou became a reality, not because it was strong, but because there was nothing else. It endured by default. And King Ping, in the twilight of his reign, came to understand a bitter truth. Endurance is not victory. To survive is not to triumph. But sometimes it is enough. In his final years, he commissioned a quiet tomb far from the main palace grounds, built into a hillside overlooking the Luo River. He asked that no statues be carved, no bronze vessels be buried with him, no lavish sacrifices made. Only a simple stone etched with the words. He held the name, though not the reign. He died in his sleep without ceremony. And as the court prepared his rites, Bao Si was mentioned once more, not in anger, not in mourning, but in caution. A single line was added to the eulogy, spoken in hushed tones by the high priest. Beware the silence that sways the world. In the silence that followed King Ping's death, the Eastern Zhou court moved through its rituals like a marionette suspended by invisible strings. The courtiers bowed. The bells rang. The incense curled in delicate spirals. But everyone knew the truth. This was no longer a dynasty that governed. It was a dynasty that remembered. The new king, Ping's son, assumed the throne with a face carved from resignation. He had grown up in the corridors of Luoyang, a city born not from triumph but from retreat. His education had been thorough classics, rights, military theory, but what he inherited was not a realm in need of governance. It was a relic in need of preservation. His role was not to rule but to maintain the appearance of rule. The throne he sat on was lighter than it looked. It bore the weight not of iron but of illusion. And in that illusion, one name continued to echo, Bao Si. Nearly a generation had passed since the flames consumed Haojing and the Western Zhou court fell. Yet the silent consort had not faded from memory. On the contrary, her legend deepened. She no longer belonged to a single history. She belonged to everyone. In markets, she was a cautionary ghost who cursed men too easily charmed. In temples, she was invoked as a test of moral clarity. In hidden texts passed between philosophers, she was debated as a symbol of feminine agency, or of political entropy, or of cosmic imbalance. Her silence had become a language of its own. Some said she had been a witch able to twist the mind of King Yu without words. Others insisted she had been a political prisoner. A woman sacrificed by a court unwilling to accept that beauty need not be ornamental. In certain circles, especially among the newer schools of philosophical inquiry, she was seen as a paradox, both passive and powerful, present and absent, real and myth. But in the halls of Luoyang's palace, where thin pillars held up the memory of imperial grandeur, her name was rarely spoken aloud. For the Eastern Zhou kings, Bao Si represented everything they could not become. She had drawn power without demanding it. She had changed the fate of a dynasty without lifting a hand. And now, long after her death, she continued to haunt the court, not as a woman, but as a question. What if the silence was not madness, but clarity? In the reign of King Huan, the second ruler of Eastern Zhou, that question began to take on dangerous life. At first, his reign followed the pattern of his father. Ceremonies, edicts, the occasional attempt at diplomacy. But like his predecessors, he was surrounded by ministers with allegiances to external lords. The state of Qi had grown bold, staging military exercises near Luoyang and offering protection to nearby provinces. Jin and Chu continued their territorial disputes, dragging smaller states into their orbit like moons around planets. The Zhou court, caught in the center, issued proclamations that no one read and hosted summits that no one respected. Yet within the court, a quiet rebellion stirred, not against the lords outside, but against the silence within. A new generation of scholars emerged, educated not in the ways of dominance, but of reflection. They studied the fall of the Western Zhou not merely as a political collapse, but as a spiritual one. To them, Bao Si was not the villain. She was the signal. Her silence, they argued, had not caused the fall, it had revealed it. Like a mirror placed before a decaying face, her refusal to perform joy had unmasked the rot beneath the robes of tradition. These scholars, inspired by her myth, began to push for reform, not in warfare or taxation, but in philosophy. They questioned the blind repetition of rites, the hollow recitation of names, the practice of hierarchy without virtue. They called their movement the doctrine of the unspoken. To them, Bao Si was not a warning. She was a revelation. The court naturally pushed back. King Huan's ministers declared the movement heretical. Some texts were banned. Scholars were exiled. A few were executed, their deaths staged as accidents. The official records were revised again, painting Bao Si as a seductress, a disruptor of heaven's order. But it was too late. The idea had taken root. And not just in philosophy, in the state of Wei. A young warlord named Ji Ku, educated in Luoyang yet disillusioned by its fragility, began to rise. Though loyal in appearance, he believed that the Zhou house no longer deserved the authority it symbolized. In private letters to his advisors, he quoted the doctrine of the unspoken, referencing Bao Si not as a threat, but as a catalyst. He wrote, "If the silence of a woman could unmask the emperor's weakness, then perhaps silence is the blade we should wield." Other warlords took different lessons. In the south, the state of Chu began promoting women to positions of ceremonial power, not as equals to men, but as embodiments of moral restraint. In their court, Bao Si was invoked as a warning against unchecked indulgence. Her legend was reshaped to support order through fear. She became the eternal observer, the face that reminded rulers to listen rather than speak, to consider rather than command. The Zhou court, watching all this unfold, remained frozen. King Huan aged quickly. His health declined. His ministers squabbled over succession. Factions formed not over military policy or tax reform, but over interpretations of a woman long dead. One group wanted her name erased entirely from the records. Another argued for a monument in her honor, to exorcise her ghost through acknowledgement. A third, secretive group believed she had never died, that she had disappeared to the west, and that her return would mark the true end of Zhou legitimacy. That last idea grew dangerous. Rumors began to spread of a woman in the western mountains, aged, veiled, always silent, who spoke to no one but was visited by many. Pilgrims came bringing offerings. Some claimed to have seen her. Others said she was a fraud, but her legend was strong enough that King Huan sent spies to investigate. They returned with conflicting reports. One said she was blind. Another claimed she glowed with moonlight. A third insisted the hut was empty. The king, already haunted by nightmares, grew paranoid. He ordered temples burned, scrolls confiscated, names struck from ancestral tablets. He saw shadows in every corridor, heard whispers in every silence. He feared that Bao Si, whether dead or alive, had become more powerful than any ruler. Not because she commanded armies, but because she commanded meaning. And in an age of symbols, meaning was mightier than swords. King Huan died without heirs. The succession was contested. The lords of the realm refused to acknowledge the candidate chosen by the court. Qi and Jin backed one pretender. Chu and Qin backed another. War loomed not because of territory, but because the center could no longer bind the edges. The Zhou dynasty once again drifted toward fracture. And all the while, in quiet corners of the world, her story continued to be told. A woman who never left. A flame that did not flicker. A ghost who still ruled. The Zhou crown, once a symbol of absolute moral order under heaven, now resembled a relic passed from trembling hand to trembling hand, light in substance, but heavy with the weight of meaning. In Luoyang, where the eastern capital struggled to present itself as the soul of a unified realm, the new king ascended with no fanfare, no uncontested claim, and no hope of restoring authority. He was not chosen by divine vision, nor appointed through clear bloodline. He was the result of compromise, a candidate acceptable to the majority of the feudal lords, not because he was inspiring, but because he posed no threat. His coronation was attended by less than half the major states. Those who came arrived with entourages larger than the royal guard itself. They paid respect not to the man, but to the idea of Zhou, a name that still commanded tradition if not allegiance. And as the new ruler took the throne, he did so in the full knowledge that he did not reign. He merely wore the costume of kingship while others wielded the knife. But what chilled him most was not the power he lacked, it was the power that still lingered, unspoken, around the name Bao Si. The silent consort's story had grown beyond control. She had passed through the stages of villain and warning and had now become something more dangerous. An icon. Not for any one camp or ideology, but for many. Each faction now claimed a different version of her. Each lord, each school of thought, each poet and propagandist had reshaped her image to serve their narrative. And in doing so, they had tethered the present to a ghost that refused to rest. In the eastern states, especially Qi and Song, reformers took inspiration from her story to critique the hollow pageantry of central authority. They claimed that Bao Si's silence was a mirror to the empty rituals of Luoyang, that a state built on pretended reverence was no different than a palace built to elicit a smile from someone who would never give it. In essays and lectures, they used her name to mock the court's obsession with ceremony over substance. To them, She represented the futility of a world in which rulers cared more for appearance than for consequence. In the West, where Qin continued to grow in strength and ambition, generals told a different story. There, Bao Si was invoked not as a philosopher's tool but as a justification for discipline. Military officers warned their troops, "Let not your heart chase beauty at the expense of command." In the walls of Qin fortresses, her name was etched into stone, as a reminder that personal indulgence leads to collective ruin. Bao Si became a cautionary figure, silent not because she chose to be, but because her silence was imposed by men who refused to hear the truth. In this version, she was both victim and scapegoat, used to justify a new age of iron-willed governance. But in the south, especially in Chu and the territories beyond, a stranger transformation occurred. There, amidst rivers and forests, Bao Si became divine. Her legend took on mystical tones. Stories emerged of how she had never died, but walked into the mountains where she communed with spirits. She had become immortal, or else her silence had turned her into a vessel of prophecy. Women gathered in secret groves to invoke her name during childbirth. Some believed that dreams of a woman in pale silk who said nothing foretold the collapse of dynasties. New cults arose, small at first, but spreading. They claimed that Bao Si's silence was not absence but wisdom, that she had seen the truth of men and chosen stillness as the ultimate act of defiance. This growing mysticism unnerved the court in Luoyang. A monarch already bound by ceremonial chains now found himself imprisoned by narrative. Every edict he issued, every ritual he led, every decree that fell flat against the indifference of the feudal states seemed to echo with her presence. Advisors warned him not to speak her name. Scribes debated whether to purge her from official histories. But each effort to suppress her image only made it grow stronger. She was in the verses of traveling minstrels, in the tattoos of rebellious young scholars, in the charms worn by midwives, in the nightmares of ministers who remembered the flames at Haojing. And so, the king tried a different approach. He ordered a statue of Bao Si commissioned, not a grand imperial likeness, but a small, silent effigy to be placed in a neutral temple near Luoyang. The goal was subtle: to recast her as a historical figure, contain her myth within stone, rob it of power through acceptance. The sculptor chosen was blind, a renowned artisan who claimed he could carve truth by touch alone. When the statue was unveiled, it depicted a woman neither beautiful nor cruel, neither young nor old. Her hands were folded, her head bowed, her expression unreadable. It was meant to calm. It did not. Worshippers came by the hundreds, then thousands. They left offerings, jade combs, silk ribbons, water from mountain springs. Some wept. Others sat for hours in silence. A few reported visions, glimpses of fire, of a king begging at her feet, of a world collapsing under the weight of longing. The statue became a pilgrimage site, and the court's attempt to contain her turned into amplification. The irony was suffocating. In life, Bao Si had been still, passive. A woman caught in the whirlpool of a king's obsession. In death or myth, she had become movement itself. Her silence, once feared, now shouted across the land. And amidst all this, the Zhou court drifted further into ceremonial irrelevance. The new king issued declarations that no one read. His emissaries were ignored. His treasury drained. His palace haunted not by ghosts, but by metaphors. The crown upon his head felt lighter each day. Not because it burdened him less, but because it meant less to everyone else. He wore it like a chain of silk, soft, beautiful, and unbreakable. And in his dreams always she returned, standing at the edge of firelight, saying nothing. The Eastern Zhou court had long ceased to be the heart of the world. In Luoyang, the rituals continued, the drumming of processions, the slow bending of knees, the careful lifting of ancestral tablets, but the power that once pulsed through these actions had become distant, spectral. The real decisions, the tides of war, the reordering of states, they happened elsewhere now, in Qi's polished war halls, in Chu's vast, river-fed cities, in Qin's fortress-laced mountains. And yet, in that hollowed-out core of dynastic ritual, a new energy began to rise, not from kings or generals but from philosophers. They came from the corners of the land, some in horse-drawn carts, others on foot. They filled the academies and private gardens, debating not over who should rule but what ruling meant. The fall of Western Zhou, the fragmentation of authority. The slow disintegration of heaven's mandate. These were no longer political problems to be solved by swords, but moral crises to be dissected by ink and thought. And at the center of that discourse stood a woman who had not spoken a word in over half a century. Bao Si, the silent consort. The name that once evoked fire and ruin now became a subject of inquiry. Then controversy and finally dogma. One school emerged first and loudest. They called themselves the harmonists, disciples of balance and order. To them, Bao Si was the embodiment of emotional indulgence. A woman whose silence had drawn a king into obsession, whose beauty had unmoored the rights of civilization. They did not blame her alone, but they held her as a symbol of the danger of personal desire in public life. Their teachings spread across noble households, where their scrolls were copied and recited. They taught that laughter must come in moderation, beauty must serve function, and silence in the face of chaos was complicity. They viewed her not with hatred, but with caution as a negative space against which to draw the right lines of governance. In opposition rose the Silentists, a newer, more radical group whose views rattled the bones of the old world. They did not see Bao Si as an error or a threat. They saw her as a revelation. To them, her refusal to perform, her silence amidst spectacle, her indifference to power, was the ultimate critique of a society built on performance. They taught that she had been surrounded by madness and refused to join in. Her stillness was not passivity. It was resistance. Her silence was not emptiness, it was protest. And thus, in a world filled with noise and illusion, Bao Si had been the only one who saw clearly. Their arguments spread like wildfire, especially among the disillusioned youth of the fractured states. Young nobles quoted Silentist texts in their letters. Officials muttered them in resignation. Some even resigned their posts, adopting private lives of ritualized silence. In certain provinces, small schools appeared where disciples lived without speaking, modeling themselves after what they imagined Bao Si to have been: self-contained, observant, incorruptible. Of course, the Zhou court could not remain neutral. King Xian, the grandson of King Ping, ruled during this strange age of philosophical fervor. He was not an ambitious man, but he was deeply suspicious of movements he could not predict, of language he could not control, and of Bao Si, whose legend seemed to grow more powerful the more time passed. When his chancellor presented him with a copy of the Meditations on the Unspoken Flame, an anonymous scroll circulating widely across the East, he read it in a single night and awoke trembling. In the scroll, the author imagined a world governed by silence. No proclamations, no punishments, no performances, only action and restraint. It ended with a single line: "What would remain if all the lies were never spoken?" He ordered it banned. But copies multiplied. Each attempt to extinguish the myth only fed it. Soon, rumors began to surface that Bao Si had been more than consort, that she had been a sage in disguise, that her beauty had not been natural but divine, that her silence had not destroyed the Western Zhou but had preserved its final dignity, that when King Yu begged for her smile, he was not asking for laughter but for forgiveness, and she, understanding the futility of the age, had withheld it. More dangerous still were the whispers that she had not vanished. In mountain temples, monks chanted her name. In remote shrines, statues were built, always with folded hands, eyes downcast. In these places, pilgrims came not for miracles, but for contemplation. They sat in silence before her effigies. They left not offerings of gold or grain, but questions written on parchment and left to burn in slow embers. What is a ruler who cannot hear silence? What is a court that cannot bear the absence of applause? What is the worth of a king who needs to be entertained? These questions spread faster than edicts. In response, the Zhou court grew desperate. King Xian summoned scribes to revise the official history of Bao Si. The new records depicted her as a foreign infiltrator planted by the Rong tribes to sabotage Zhou. They claimed she poisoned King Yu's mind, that she had plotted with the Shin clan, that her silence had been not wisdom but disease. But no one believed it, not even the scribes who wrote it. The people had chosen their legend, and even the lords, once cautious, began to reshape her for their purposes. The Duke of Qi commissioned a mural in his palace showing Bao Si atop a mountain, pointing downward at warring states, her expression unreadable. In Jin, a secret society adopted her image as its emblem, a flame inside a circle of silence. In Chu, A scholar named Lian Yu published the Book of the Flame Without Smoke, a philosophical tract arguing that Bao Si represented the mandate of heaven's final mercy, a silent judgment upon a world unworthy of guidance. Luoyang, meanwhile, faded further. The court still sat, still prayed, still bowed before heaven. But the people no longer looked to the king for direction. They looked to the stories, the lessons, the legend of the woman who had never claimed power, yet whose memory now shaped the values of a crumbling age. And the king, in his quiet chambers, began to dream, not of thrones or banners, but of a woman in pale silk, sitting in a garden that no longer existed, while the beacons burned all around her, and her lips never moved. In the final days of the Zhou dynasty, the capital no longer resembled a court. It resembled a mausoleum. The halls of Luoyang, once constructed in haste to salvage legitimacy from the ashes of Haojing, had become places where echoes gathered in search of meaning. The bronze bells rang for ceremonies no one believed in. The sacrificial fires burned for ancestors whose names had lost their grip on reverence. And the throne, polished, high, draped in silk, was occupied not by a sovereign, but by a caretaker. The last Zhou kings were not tyrants. They were caretakers of memory, bound not by authority but by inertia. They issued decrees that traveled no further than the walls that held them. They prayed to gods who no longer answered. They watched as the world fractured into ambition and iron, each state sharpening its identity not in loyalty to heaven, but in opposition to it. The Zhi were no longer rulers. They were placeholders for a past that no one knew how to bury. Yet through all of this, one legacy endured. She had never ruled. She had never spoken. But by the end, she was all that remained. Bao Si, the silent consort. The name outlived the dynasty. In the Eastern academies, her silence was quoted as the highest form of truth. In the Western military schools, her myth was etched into tactical doctrine: guard against the unseen, question the unspoken. In southern temples, her effigy received more offerings than the spirits of emperors. And in the northern markets, her story was traded like silver, reshaped by every mouth, yet always untouched at its core. She never laughed. And in that refusal, she changed the shape of the world. The final Zhou king, known posthumously as King Nan, was born into a court already hollow. He grew up amid stories of power that once was, of cities long lost, of a woman whose silence caused an empire to fall and a new age to question everything. He read every version: the harmonists who blamed her, the silentists who praised her, the mysticists who deified her. And in private he wrote a scroll of his own. If silence is what remains when all voices fail, then it is not the silence that condemns us. It is the noise we created before it. King Nan ruled not by strength but by observation. He traveled more than any Zhou king before him, not as a conqueror but as a witness. He visited the lords of Qi and Jin, received as a guest, not a master. He stood on the southern banks of Chu, watching their river fleets. He sat with Qin generals who no longer offered him obeisance but gave him courtesy, like a respected elder whose time had passed. And in every state he saw Bao Si not in flesh but in influence. She was a parable in every tongue, a test passed from ruler to ruler. Could they resist the temptation to chase the applause of beauty, the validation of desire, the performance of legitimacy? Most failed, but not in the same way her king had. They failed not from obsession with her, but from trying to escape her shadow, and in doing so, repeated the same mistakes under different masks. King Nan returned to Luoyang a tired man. He ordered no more ceremonies. He closed the outer gates of the court. He dismissed the ministers who had nothing left to administer. And then, in the quiet, he penned the final royal decree of the Zhou dynasty. Let the mandate of heaven be unbound. Let the people write their own history. The flame has faded not because it failed, but because its light is no longer needed. He sealed the decree. He left it unread by the world. And then he walked west. Some said he disappeared into the mountains where Bao Si was last seen. Others claimed he became a monk living in silence. A few believed he had gone in search of her tomb, not to condemn, but to understand. In time, war consumed the land. The warring states' era unfolded in full. Kings rose and fell not by mandate, but by sword. New philosophies bloomed: legalism, Taoism, the strict codification of power, and the quiet rejection of it. Qin would rise, unified and ruthless. But even in their libraries, carved into cold stone, Bao Si remained. She was the ungovernable memory, the truth that no victor could erase. Not a queen, not a goddess, not a villain, not a hero, only a presence that revealed everything by doing nothing. In the end, history did not remember her for what she said or what she ruled, or even what she did. It remembered her for what she withheld. And in that absence, she became the most lasting voice of all. So it was that the Zhou fell. Not to battle, not to rebellion, but to silence.